Well, you're looking at a beautiful drone shot from Drone 4 high above Mackinac Island on just a gorgeous, classic, pure Michigan morning. Great to have you with us here for this special edition of Flashpoint coming to you today on Local 4 Plus. We've been preempted on the broadcast side by the French Open, but that's okay. It just doesn't get any nicer than this. Tim and I are having a hard time remembering better weather for this convention, or this meeting that we come to every year, this policy conference. I often think back to the very first one that I came to 20 years ago, when it was actually snowing as I walked up the hill. I prefer this quite a bit. And it was a very, very busy week, so much to discuss, and we're going to bring you a number of different components of the discussions and topics that kicked around here. I always say there are two different agendas on the island. There's the one that the chamber designs, and then there's the one that takes place organically in the hallways and out here on the porch. But we're going to start with one that was a part of the formal proceedings, and that was the big announcement this past week from Ford Motor Company with a huge investment, not only in Michigan, but also Ohio and in Missouri, all toward, certainly with an eye toward electrification, but billions and billions of dollars being spread around. It's going to mean thousands and thousands of jobs in the state of Michigan. And I started my conversation with Governor Whitmer on that topic. Governor, good to see you as always. Let's talk about first this massive announcement that you just made with Ford Motor Company. Interesting because Michigan's had some wins and losses on some of these really big plants, but I think you feel like you're starting to figure out the recipe.
Well, this is a huge win. And listen, no state's going to get 100% of any, one company's investment. You know, they're moving fast, they're looking for opportunity, they're making huge investments. This $2 billion investment that Ford announced today is a statement that they are a Michigan company, always have been, they're always going to be. But really growing their EV, growing their production in Michigan is a huge victory. And these are really good paying jobs and secures our leadership, and as this sector of our economy continues to evolve fast.
But it is also a statement, though, isn't it, about the toolkit that the state has been trying to get together so that you don't end up with what happened last fall and finding out that these big projects were going to Kentucky and Tennessee.
I think, the old knock on Michigan was that we didn't have the same tools other states had. We moved too slow, and Lansing was dysfunctional. Last December, we knocked that narrative upside down. We moved fast in a collaborative way with the legislature, and we really enhanced our tool set. And so now we are delivering. We've got this $7 billion investment from General Motors that we announced earlier this year, $1.7 billion investment from LG Chemical Solution. This is, I think, one more in a long story that we are writing that is about investment, cutting edge, and Michigan winning when it comes to telling the story and earning this kind of investment.
You also took pains to make sure you mentioned today that these were UAW jobs, and the narrative for so long was that union states were not going to be able to compete. The jobs were, of course, going to flee to non-union culture places and places where unions weren't expected to be a part of the picture. What is happening there, do you think?
Probably a lot of things, and I don't want to oversimplify it, but I'll just say this. When we think about advanced manufacturing in America, it is a homeland security issue. We've got to be the world's manufacturer, and we can't outsource these things or we are at a huge disadvantage. When we grow jobs and investment in manufacturing, and they happen to be UAW jobs, they're going to be really good paying jobs. You're going to have a workforce that has the skills, and they are partners with the employer. And so Ford has seen that, recognizes and values that. Same with General Motors. I mean, we've got a powerful story to tell, and workers need to have a voice at the table, but they also need to have real buy-in, and that's what Ford does. That's what General Motors does, and that's why they've been so successful.
Well, talk about the CHIPS Act and how important that is to the state. You were just mentioning that down at the bottom of the hill.
Yeah, well, it's crucial. So no one knew what a semiconductor was. All right, some people knew. But the majority of the public did not appreciate but a semiconductor is crucial, whether it's what's in your phone or powers your vehicle or your toaster. I mean, like,
runs everything.
Everything. The CEO of Whirlpool made sure that I knew, semiconductors aren't just for cars, they're for washing machines as well. I mean, this is a big deal.
Right.
And so we've come to a standstill at times because too much of the industry that was created in America is now done in different parts of the globe. It's been a real struggle for manufacturing. And so making sure that Michigan is a place that we can build semiconductor fabs is crucial. The CHIPS Act is a linchpin to that. We've got to make it competitive to do that in North America, and Congress needs to take action. And I'm grateful so many in our delegation get it and they're working on it, but we got to get this over the finish line.
Let me get to a couple other topics. Yesterday, the Transportation Secretary, Pete Buttigieg, was here, and you spoke to him, and you both talked a little bit about trying to alleviate the pressure that people are feeling at the pump. What can we do?
Well, you know what, I think we can give people some relief right now. I've proposed giving a tax rebate, $500.
I want to get to that, but that's different from
what you're... That's a quick way that we could get money in people's pockets.
Yep.
I've also suggested perhaps we get rid of the sales tax on gas. That would give people some relief at the pump. But what I'm interested in is something that's going to give people relief right now. And we're negotiating with the legislature. I'm confident we're going to land on something meaningful that will actually help people and do so quickly. But they got a budget that we're also negotiating and hoping to get everything wrapped up in the next few weeks.
You just mentioned you'd like to see checks going back out in the form of tax rebates. The other side really would rather see a change in tax rates and tax policy. One would seem to be a short-term answer. The other one seems to be longer term. Where do you come together on this, do you think?
Well, I think we got to be fiscally responsible. We've got a lot of resources right now, unlike anything we've ever seen in decades. A lot of it's one-time money, some of it is ongoing, and that's why as we think about a policy that gives people relief right now, we've got to be cognizant of what the broader implications are. So it's hard to be the one that's saying we got to be fiscally responsible, but we do. And we can afford to make those long-term investments that set us up for long-term prosperity and give people some relief right now, and that's where I'm hoping we can get to very soon.
It kind of creates one of the older dynamics in politics that Republicans want lower taxes and Democrats want to keep them higher for government to spend.
Well, I have proposed, and we've gotten some tax relief. We eliminated the tampon tax. We've gotten small business tax relief in the form of property tax. I mean, we have cut taxes. I'm proud of that. Yeah. We've made historic investments without raising taxes, not 1 cent. I'm proud of that too. We are in a position right now where we can give people some relief and continue to make sure our kids have all the supports they need to get the education that sets them up for success, and to close the skills gap, to protect our water. I mean, these are fundamentals that we can and will continue to do and give people some relief right now.
Lastly, let me talk a little politics with you, which is inescapable in a big midterm year for midterms for others, but for you, much bigger than a midterm matter. We just had the poll that came out that the Chamber released at the beginning of this conference that showed that while Michiganders are far more pessimistic about what's happening nationally, they're still rather pessimistic about Michigan too. About half of them think that the state is going in the wrong direction. What do you do to change that narrative?
And half of them feel really good, and I'm a glass half full
Not sure it was
person.
Quite half,
I couldn't do this work if I didn't see the opportunity.
Sure.
The fact of the matter is, it's been a hard couple of years. There's no question. Yeah. Everyone is exhausted. Everyone is frustrated. We want some normalcy. And the last thing people want to do is talk about politics. They just want to live their lives and know their kids are going to be safe at school, know their rights aren't going to be taken away, know that you can pursue any dream you have in the great state of Michigan. We're making progress. Unemployment's low. We've got huge investment that's happening. So there's a lot of good that's happening. We still have challenges. We fixed a ton of roads. There's a lot more that we got to do. But we're making progress, and I'm going to continue to keep my sleeves rolled up and stay at the table and work with anyone who wants to solve a problem. This is a great state, but the best part about it is the people who call it home.
We have the benefit of hindsight now, which of course you didn't have at the beginning of the pandemic. As you look back now, what would you have done differently? If you knew now, or if you knew then what you know now, what would you have done differently?
If I could go back in a time machine with the knowledge that we have now, would that inform different decisions? Of course it would. Mm-hmm. But of course, we
Which
were dealing
ones?
with a novel virus.
Yep.
We thought the virus was communicated through touch, not through respiration. So a lot of the early policies were informed by past experiences with global pandemics, without the knowledge of what this novel virus, the real threat of it, and how it was communicated. So, of course, if any leader says I would never change a thing with new information, well, they're lying or they're dangerous. I recognize I am not an epidemiologist or a public health expert. That's why I listened to the smartest, made the best informed decisions in the middle of a crisis that was taking people's lives. And we are in a much stronger position. A lot of lives were spared because of the work we did.
Last question. I've been asking a lot of people this here, and I'm curious, what's the most interesting thing that you've heard that you want to chew on for a while at this year's policy conference?
Well, I appreciate the comments of Ted Koppel. I thought he made a compelling case. I thought John Meacham, I'm always looking for perspective, historic perspective and, incredibly challenging times. And I was thrilled that Secretary Buttigieg was here. He knows how to pronounce Gaylord because he owns a place in Traverse City.
Yes.
He really is a Michigander in a lot of ways, and he's been an incredible partner. And he pointed out, because we've been focused on infrastructure longer than many other parts of the country, we're in a stronger position to move fast and deploy these dollars that are coming in from the feds. And I'm excited about the opportunity in front of us.
That was a couple of different things instead of just one. So
There's
you've
a
had
lot going
a
on
good
here.
couple of days then.
Yeah.
Governor, it's always good to talk to you. I appreciate the time.
Thanks, Devin.
Now, of course, there are a number of people who would like to replace Governor Whitmer, and that was part of the subtext, the drama building around exactly who these Republican candidates are going to be in this really big election year. It's been playing out day by day because, of course, of the petition signature problems that so many of the candidates had, which cut the field in half. They've been in legal fights, several of them who've been trying to get their way back on the ballot, but it's all pretty much been decided by now. There are still a couple of appeals remaining to the state Supreme Court, but we seem to be down to the 5 candidates finally that we have, and 4 of those 5 took part in a debate on Thursday here on the island.
And we all know Governor Whitmer is an extremist on abortion. She's an extremist on death. I mean, she's the very one who put COVID-infected elderly in the nursing homes.
I'm convinced that if we don't get God right in this next election, nothing's going to matter. When you look at the last 60 years, that's what the difference is. We're trying to solve our problems without having God in culture.
I proposed having former military that could volunteer and work in our school system with a state police program that would train them as hall monitors.
I love that you say that this is what the governor ran on, but I'm not sure if you heard the breaking news. Yesterday, she came out and said that she didn't promise she was going to fix the roads. So I don't know if she's trying to backpedal. She says she needs a second term to make sure she's going to do that.
It's often the case in primary elections. It's not easy to find a real wide range of difference in the opinions among these candidates, and it certainly felt that way to me in watching that debate the other afternoon. They agree on, they're all against abortion. They're all in favor of gun rights. They all, of course, share a certain disdain for Governor Whitmer. Really hard to find a whole lot of difference in the positions of them, but we could certainly, and I think you could see there, maybe some stylistic differences in their approach, and that may end up deciding this election as we move forward. I also talked to this past week, though, to our pollster at the Glenn Gariff Group, Richard Zuba, who in conjunction with the chamber released a poll just ahead of the policy conference to try and give everybody who was coming here a sense of where Michiganders are in the middle of 2022. Let's start with how people are feeling about life in general. It's interesting. Among Michiganders, the outlook is more pessimistic for the rest of the country than it is for the state.
That's true. Right now, we've got only, under 20% of the voters who view the nation going on the right track. But in Michigan, it's double. It's almost 40% of voters, or not 40, but it's up in the 30s. And they're making a difference. They're seeing a difference between how voters are viewing Michigan versus how they're viewing what's happening nationally. And that really comes down to the economy. The economy is just a central focus right now of what people are worried about, and it's inflation. And that's a whole new ball game than we're used to seeing here in Michigan.
The other thing that was really interesting, though, is that even as people were telling you that the economy was the biggest issue and they're worried about inflation, most of the people that you talk to felt that their own personal economies were either better or the same as before.
That's right. It's a huge, overwhelming majority who felt they're doing the same or better than they were in the past. Only 28% said they were doing worse. And those people said because of inflation. But boy, oh boy, people think the national economy is on the wrong track because of inflation. And there's a huge difference by age. We asked this question, do you think inflation is going to be around for years, or do you think it's a short-term thing? And 54% said they think it's going to be around for years, but they were disproportionately under the age of 50. And those are the people who have never dealt with inflation before. And if you look at people over 50, they lived through the 70s, and they understand what inflation was. And there's a big difference what it is now versus what it was then in terms of jobs. And one of the really surprising numbers in this poll is only 3% of Michiganders are really concerned about losing their jobs. This is Michigan. This is the state of jobs. We're always concerned about jobs, but not now.
What does that tell us? It's a weird disconnect to be so worried about the economy and yet not be that worried about your own personal finances and not be that worried about your own employment.
I think they're hearing one story. They're hearing a story about inflation, and they see it every single day. They see it in the gas prices. They see it in bread and milk prices. It's in front of them every day. What's not in front of them every day is the second story, that their neighbors are all employed, that there are abundant job opportunities. In fact, one of the numbers we found was that 50% of those who are 18 to 29 have shifted jobs since COVID hit. There's this great realignment occurring in the workforce because there's a lot of job opportunities right now.
So let's move to politics. Our bread and butter, you and I. What did you learn about what feels like a very fraught and tight political year? What were the findings that you walked away with most impressed by?
Well, I think first of all we looked at motivation, and motivation is through the roof on both sides of the aisle. And it is increasingly through the roof with Democratic women because of the threat of Roe v. Wade being overturned. 61% of them are more likely to vote, they said, are more motivated to vote if Roe v. Wade is overturned. So turnout-wise, this is going to look like 18 and 20. It's not going to look like 14 or 16 with low turnouts. People are going to vote. Joe Biden's numbers, there's no way to say it, they're abysmal in Michigan. 36% approval. They have decreased again, and they've decreased particularly with independents, where only 19% of independents approve of the job he's doing. Comparatively, Governor Whitmer, she's still above water at 48-40. She's in the upper 40s where she's always been. She's not at 50, which should concern her. It shows this is going to be a close, tight-fought race. But, one of the really interesting numbers I saw in those for Governor Whitmer was 25% of leaning Republican voters have a favorable view of the job she's doing. And if you look specifically, 42% of leaning Republican women have a favorable view of the job she's doing. And, all my political career, we've all talked about the pro-choice moderate women of Oakland County, and that's what we're looking at. And for the first time, it's not going to be an existential question about Roe v. Wade. It's going to be a real question about the existence of it.
The poll included, you talked about Roe v. Wade in the poll. It was done before what happened in Uvalde. And I'm wondering if does that change, do you think, the outlook, given all the concentration right now and talk about guns in America?
I think it absolutely does. I mean, polls are a moment in time. And that moment, we did this was several weeks ago before the Texas shooting. The Texas shooting is going to have an impact on numbers if we did a poll now. How long is the real question. We've been in this position before. We've seen temporary bumps due to these horrific shootings. But then the numbers tend to go back to where they were.
Yeah.
That's reality.
Many times now. Do you think, and this is a weird question, does it matter who the Republican candidate for governor is? Or is this simply an R and D year?
I do think it matters because independents are going to decide this race. Whoever the Republicans nominate, they're going to have rock solid support with the Republican base of voters. Governor Whitmer's going to be the Democrat. She's already got lock solid support there. This will be decided in the middle with independents, particularly Southeast Michigan independents, which is why we're watching that number so closely. And, you know, there's two interesting cross currents coming here. One is inflation, and one is the potential of Roe v. Wade. And now we can add, I think, the Texas shooting and gun laws. And how these cross currents play with independents is really going to decide how these elections look. But I find it hard to believe that inflation isn't going to play a really, really big role with these independents.
Somebody once said it's the economy, stupid.
That's right.
That's now a phrase that's over 20 years old, but it remains the truth, right?
Right. It's the economy. And what's interesting is they're holding Joe Biden far more accountable for inflation than they are Governor Whitmer. They see this as a Washington issue, not a Lansing issue. Yeah. But there's no way to sugarcoat the fact that if your party is in power and these economic numbers look this bad, you should be worried.
Lastly, just curious as to give me your take on all of these Republican candidates who have been kicked off the ballot over this petition signature issue.
Sheer and utter incompetence. I mean, number one rule of any campaign is get on the ballot. Get your signatures, look at your signatures, make sure they're good. I mean, this is historically unprecedented to see this many people bounced off the ballot, and don't blame it on anybody else but your own campaign. I mean, there are campaigns like Tudor Dixon, Garrett Soldano, the other Republicans, they got their signatures. These other campaigns did not. There was no plot against them. It was pure incompetence on their campaign's part.
You don't see their legal challenges having any chance?
I don't know how. Yeah. I just don't know how.
Pollsters like Richard Zuba, like Steve Mitchell, who often appears on Flashpoint, no doubt are going to be very, very busy as things tighten up as we move toward the general election in November. I want to go back to the big Ford announcement, which has a lot of different implications. It certainly shows more of the commitment that Ford has to electrification, though it also included internal combustion engine vehicles that are being developed as well. But it also says maybe something about Michigan starting to figure out the formula for being able to attract some of these really big and important economic development projects, massive projects that bring with them many, many jobs. And I sat down to talk with Steve Crowley of Ford, along with Congresswoman Debbie Dingell, whose district has a number of those plants that are going to benefit. Steve, let me start with you and this huge announcement that you've made today. These things are in the works for a long, long time. Tell me a little bit about how all this came together.
Sure. Well, it's clear that we're committed to continuing the transformation of our company, and that will require expanding certain of our facilities, both to make electric vehicles and our iconic ICE combustion vehicles. We have had a partnership with the state of Michigan, long-standing, 119 years to be exact, and have found great partners in our federal partners, our local partners, and our state partners, the governor, the MEDC, and legislative leaders. They all came together in a bipartisan way that was emphasized by the governor and others this morning to put together an attractive package for Ford that allows us to recommit to the state and several facilities. Obviously, as you suggest, there's a lot that goes into that. We're interested in the intangibles. Who can we really partner with to allow us to double down? Yeah. And that's what we've done. We're going to expand production at the Rev C for the F-150 Lightning, bring an all-new Ranger to Michigan, and a Mustang Coupe as well. Those to the Michigan assembly plants and Flat Rock facilities.
The commitment to electrification is if it hasn't become clear to people by now, but coming off the comments yesterday, my conversation with Pete Buttigieg here, I think a lot of people think that we're still pushing all this a little too quickly for, pick your reason. It's still too expensive for many people to afford. The grid may not be ready for it, on and on and on. Talk a little bit about your outlook on it.
Sure. Well, our outlook in the long term is that the world is going to move to electric vehicles. You're right, we need to get from here to there, and there are a number of important policy questions and economic questions associated with that, as you suggest, grid infrastructure, battery costs, kind of consumer habits. But look, I think the world is changing faster than many expected. Certainly, we've seen a demand for our electric products, the F-150 Lightning, the Mach-E electrified Mustang, that is, surpassed anyone's expectations, candidly. And we see that kind of consumer demand around the world, here in the United States for sure, but also in Europe and other places. So we'll continue to work with our government partners to make sure that the grid is ready, that we have the infrastructure in place. But I think that consumers are chomping at the bit for this new technology.
I want you to address a little bit of the criticism that I know that you hear as, states falling all over each other, that some describe as a race to the bottom, trying to, outbid and outspend and feather the nest of companies that are already multi-gazillion dollar companies. How do you address that criticism when you hear that?
Yeah, look, I mean, economic development is sort of the core responsibility of states and state leaders, I think, and this is no different than what states do. They try to attract companies. Michigan has done a great job of attracting Ford, again, historically speaking, and recently as well. Other states and frankly other countries are interested in bringing economic development to their citizenry, right, to their jurisdictions, to attract jobs and commerce, and I think that's a healthy competition.
Congresswoman, as you know, Michigan has taken its lumps over some projects that didn't come. Kentucky, Tennessee, most recently Stellantis deciding to move operations to Indiana. But the announcement today, the one earlier this year from General Motors, are we getting this figured out? This package, what are we figuring out? What's the secret sauce here?
First of all, I think it's a very serious conversation that we have to have in Michigan, which I've been pretty blunt on, as you know. And we lost those packages. We lost those plants coming here because people look at the state. I've had this conversation with 20 different companies looking to locate a plant. When they go to other states, the red carpet is laid out. People come and welcome them. They have no idea if somebody's a Democrat or Republican, and it's the partnerships of the utility companies, the Chamber of Commerce. It's the welcoming, we want you here environment. And I think, quite frankly, Ford's announcement was a wake-up call for many people in the state when they didn't choose Michigan for 2 manufacturing facilities, which is why there was an all-out effort to attract GM. Everybody was part of that. I mean, the governor worked very hard on that, but I talked to Mary Barra multiple times on that. I'm pleased by Ford's announcement today because they're my plants. They're my workers.
Yes.
And Flat Rock has been very worried about what the future of that plant was going to be. Those workers have been, this is about workers. The UAW workers they've been worried about their jobs. And, the Rouge plant, which is where the Lightning is being made, I said to the president, if you want EVs to be real, not foo-foo cars, come to Michigan, go to Dearborn, go to that Rouge plant and show people what an electric vehicle truck can do. And he did, and they've seen that. But Devin, I also want to say to you, you are right. I was very proud. I worked very hard with the environmentalists and the unions on the environmentalists hearing the union concerns. We stood at the White House, everybody together last August. But there's 3 things we need to reach that 2030 goal. The companies know that for the environment, they've got to get there. They're committed. 1, the vehicles need to be affordable. The tax incentive that has been there, that incentive until we get into more mass production and the costs come down matter, and Congress has to renew it. We haven't done it. 2, we got to invest in that R&D battery so that it's got the range that people have confidence, and we got to mine those minerals here. The next table I'm putting together with the environmentalists and the workers is that mining, and it's got more people at it, but working that. And 3, we do need to upgrade the power grid and build the infrastructure. All things we were trying to do in legislation that's become a little stonewalled, and I'm trying to work with the Joe Manchins of the world and my Republican friends that to get there, we've got to do those things.
The CHIPS bill is also
yes.
a big issue here.
We need to get the Competes bill done. The Secretary of Commerce agrees with me, the President agrees with me. I know I have Republican friends and Democratic friends that think we need to get it done. Now the Speaker is telling me hopefully by the 4th of July, but there are others that want to play games with it. There are some things we should not be playing political games with. And when it comes to our economy and jobs in this country and our competitiveness, we should not be playing games with that. We need to bring chip production back to this country. We need to bring our supply chain back to this country. We need to get that bill done. That pandemic has taught us in many different ways we cannot be so dependent on other countries.
Steve, you're shaking your head on the CHIPS bill. Microchips are like cereal for you guys, right?
Yes, the Congresswoman puts it perfectly. We need to get the CHIPS funding bill done. I know she's working hard. We're going to continue to push for that. It's a matter of supply chain security for us, and the pandemic has taught us, all of us, that is, important lessons, and we'll continue to advocate to bring within country, re-domesticate really some of those capabilities.
Let me ask you about a thing that comes up a lot with long term, especially. I have the Mustang Mach-E, and it's the best car I've ever owned.
Excellent.
I absolutely love it. What I'm trying to figure out is eventually what's going to happen with that battery. Am I going to need to replace it many years down the road? And if I do, where's it going to go? This is kind of a huge conundrum that maybe we started making these a little ahead of our plan and figured we'd figure it out. But where are we right now on that?
It's a great question and an important issue. Yeah, eventually we'll want to recycle these batteries because at some point they will, like any battery does, wear out over time, yep. Presumably before the life of the rest of your car. We are working with partners, new and old. One important partner, Redwood Materials, to enter into a cycling plan for them, so we can extract what's useful out of an old battery. That's important for all sorts of reasons, for economic reasons, again, for supply chain security reasons. The more we can recycle, the less mining we need to do, and so forth. So that issue is very much at the top of our list of issues to work through as we continue to electrify.
I also mentioned another one, which is range. What do you see? What are you seeing that maybe the rest of us haven't gotten a glimpse of yet toward what range capacity really can become?
Yes. Well, there is a spectrum of different ranges, right? And it'll depend ultimately on what kind of confidence consumers have over the charging infrastructure. Yeah. Before that infrastructure is prolific, people are talking about and thinking about range. I have a Mach-E as well, right? And we kind of calculate, all right, where can we get to on our next trip? That kind of calculation will be less and less necessary over time. Yeah. And consumers will really choose for themselves, do they want to pay for, let us say, a slightly more expensive battery with a longer range? Will they instead make the compromise for a different kind of battery that might be more affordable and a shorter range, because now they can hook up at work, at home, in between, and so forth. So the market's going to sort that issue out. We just need to continue to work for the infrastructure to get from here to there.
Yeah, Congresswoman, I want to go back to the jobs that you just talked about in your district. That's a lot. But there are also, the governor took pains, I talked to her about this earlier, she took pains to point out there were UAW jobs. And talk a little bit about the outlook for union jobs in the manufacturing world, because the narrative, as you know, 10 to 15 years ago was that all those jobs are heading to the places where nobody's expecting to join a union.
Well, I think we need to understand what unions do for all of us in this country and how all of us have benefited from unions. And I think if you talk to the OEMs, they'll talk about what an important partner the UAW is for them. In terms of if you go to any of the unions, in terms of training and apprenticeships and making sure you've got a skilled workforce. But I just would like to point out to everybody that we take things for granted, like vacations, holidays, health insurance, sick days. Even in a school, the teacher-to-student ratio, the patient-to-nurse ratio have all been negotiated by a union. All of us benefit from what a union's negotiated. I think the UAW is one of they help create the middle class in this country. They want to keep working men and women strong. I'm obviously a strong union supporter. The president is a strong union supporter. And I think we're showing that we can compete with other states for those jobs.
And you took pains today to talk about the multiplier effect, which I'm not sure everybody fully can grasp when they hear, 2,000 to 3,000 jobs, and then what that. Talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So if you start from 6,200 new union manufacturing jobs, or 3,200 here in Michigan, that adds to the economic ecosystem, because that means those workers will have more money to spend, but it also means as we're building these additional vehicles, we'll have increased needs from our suppliers, for professional services, for different kinds of vendors. So we're stimulating the economy quite literally, in that every dollar we invest or every worker we hire will multiply itself. And there are different formula for calculating those multipliers. But what it means is, given one worker, do we get 4 jobs or 10 jobs, and so forth.
Yeah. Last thing I want you both to address is there's been a lot of talk and a little bit of hand-wringing over whether Michigan has already been falling behind a little bit in the EV race. We're clearly competing with Silicon Valley, competing with lots of different startups. There's a lot of exciting things happening out there. But talk about Michigan's positioning, and let me start with you, Steve. Obviously, you believe that hub that's around what's going on in Corktown is a big part of where we expect that information and technology to come from. But should we worry about Michigan's positioning right now in this massively important race?
Yes, we will continue to look forward to working with our partners in state government and working with the state of Michigan. The Corktown facility, which you mentioned, is important, but also what we're doing at the train station. The train station, Central Station, will be.
So that's what I meant.
Sorry, very good. Will be a major hub for connectivity, for electrification. We'll bring in. You mentioned Silicon Valley. We'll bring in partners into that facility from California, including Silicon Valley. And we're, even as I speak, hiring new people from around the world, including Silicon Valley, who are excited about coming to Ford and coming to work for this Michigan company because the race is on, and Michigan is very much in the competition for sure.
Look, we have to be intentional. Nobody's going to hand this to us on a silver platter.
Yes, we certainly. A lot of people think just assume it's our birthright. We're the car place.
One of my major priorities is making sure we put the world on wheels. We put the world on wheels. And I intend that Michigan's going to stay at the forefront of innovation and technology, and we're going to be the world leader in mobility. But all of us need to understand that requires us to be very intentional in our work. We can take nothing for granted. We can take nobody for granted. We all have to work together. The governor is a leader on it, but the legislature, the federal, state, local levels of government have to partner with many different partners throughout this state, or we're going to lose that leadership role. And I don't intend to let that happen.
Oh, that beautiful shot overhead. Kind of beautifully ironic, isn't it, that we would spend so much time talking about transportation on Mackinac Island with its horse-drawn carriages and no motorized vehicles. And in fact, the irony of that was not lost on the Transportation Secretary, Pete Buttigieg, who gave the keynote address this past Wednesday.
One proposal was that I compliment the local transit system for how stable it is. There's another suggestion that I offered to support Mackinac's answer to our high-speed rail proposals with a Seabiscuit 3000 system. We went through a lot of these and then concluded it was best that we all stick to our day jobs, but I just wanted to give you a flavor of the preparation. Before I get into the substance of what I'd like to say in the conversation we're going to have, I want to say what a pleasure it really is to be here. This is actually the first time since getting this job that I've had the chance to make an official appearance within driving distance of the house that Chasten and I got near Traverse City a couple years ago, which very much came to feel like a home about 1 year ago, a little less, when we brought home our 2 newborn twins so they could be close to their grandparents. And like every new parent, it has turned our world upside down. But Northern Michigan was a wonderful place to get up and running with them. And I've always felt a very close connection to this state. I won't channel the former Alaska governor and say that I could see Michigan from my house, but you could in fact see it from the mayor's office window out there in South Bend. And when I was a consultant, my first client assignment was in Detroit. And I have to tell you, it's been extraordinary to see the growth, the investment, and most importantly, the pride that has grown in the heart of that city in the 15 years since I found myself working there. And I know that that is a tribute to so many of the people at this convening and so many of the people in this room. And I believe it's part of the broader and too often overlooked story of how the industrial Midwest has found its way to a more promising future by staying true to its greatest strengths without allowing itself to be held back by nostalgia or any kind of fear of the future. And of course, that's a story that we were very proud of during my time as mayor in South Bend, too. And now that I am in front of you in this new capacity as Secretary of Transportation, I'm mindful that I'm addressing leaders from a state that lives and breathes transportation in so many ways, including, but by no means limited to, the role that this state plays in our nation's all-important auto industry. And I'm here to tell you that this role, this work that so many of you are involved in, connected to our transportation, connected to our infrastructure, has never mattered more. And I'm here on behalf of the Biden-Harris administration to let you know that the American transportation and infrastructure sector now has a level of federal support that we haven't seen in most of our lifetimes. After years and years, decades and decades of so-called infrastructure weeks coming and going in Washington without result, we have finally delivered the basis for an infrastructure decade. And some 6 months since the president signed that bill into law, that infrastructure decade is very much underway. I want to acknowledge Governor Whitmer for understanding the importance of transportation infrastructure from day one of this administration. And frankly, challenging Washington to catch up to the work that state leaders like her have been doing as those infrastructure weeks had come and gone. Matter of fact, she likes to call me the Secretary of Fix the Damn Roads, which sounds about right to me. And as a result of her leadership, now that we have delivered this legislation on the federal level, this is a state that will be exceptionally well poised to take advantage of that infrastructure law, thanks to the running start that you have here. And I especially want to thank the members of the federal delegation here in Michigan, Senator Peters and Senator Stabenow, who played such an important role in crafting the Senate side of the legislation, and the 7 Michigan House members, 6 Democrats and 1 Republican, who supported the bipartisan infrastructure law at a time when a lot of people were skeptical that you could get a bipartisan anything law done in today's Washington. They refused to let it get bogged down in the politics. They refused to give up, and they defied the idea that in today's Washington you couldn't get anything done at all. And I want to thank the Detroit Chamber for your support, because seeing so many sectors across America come together in support of this work, including business leadership and union leadership alike, it's a big part of what made it possible for us to deliver. So let's talk about the state of play. 6 months and counting since the president signed that law on the South Lawn of the White House, we've already put forward $100 billion in funding. We're proceeding swiftly but judiciously to make a reality out of these planned improvements in our roads and our bridges, our trains and transit systems, our ports and our airports, not to mention the water and grid and broadband improvements beyond the transportation portfolio that are going to be so meaningful, especially in states like Michigan. In that period, $3 billion has already been announced as heading to Michigan alone, with more announcements coming as soon as tomorrow. State and local departments are gearing up, calls are going out, bids are coming in, and we are getting to enter the shovel-turning season. We can discuss the programs and the projects in more detail, but I want to do just briefly to frame the conversation is paint a picture of what success looks like. Because for this to succeed, it has to be something that's meaningful, even if you're by no means an infrastructure buff. This isn't about infrastructure for its own sake. This is about producing benefits for Americans that remind us why we care about our infrastructure. Success means that we will have a safer transportation system, saving tens of thousands of American lives. Success means that we will create family wealth for millions of households, both from actually working directly on the improvements as laborers or professionals, and from living in communities that have the cleaner water and the smoother roads and the better rail and air and sea links to the rest of the country and the rest of the world. Success means that we will help to decarbonize the transportation of people and goods, which is a task that represents a large portion of the overall work that America and humanity have to do on climate change in order to save millions of lives and trillions of dollars in property and economic value that will otherwise be destroyed by extreme weather, droughts, floods, and fires. Success means America will be a fairer country, where old patterns of racial exclusion and the exclusion of rural economies in our transportation systems are replaced by a new insistence that those systems help everyone to have a fair shot at thriving. And success in that implementation means that America's position as the world's leading economy will be secure for the balance of this century. Those are the stakes. Those are the opportunities if we succeed. And if we don't, we won't get this opportunity to get again. So, success means partnerships at every level. And I'm pleased to report that there have been fantastic alignments and engagements already between different levels of government, different communities, between the public, private, academic, and labor sectors. And that is going to have to continue in order to ensure that our future of transportation is better than anything that we've seen before, with a laser-like focus on getting things done. I am convinced that the 2020s are going to go down in history as one of the most transformative periods ever in U.S. transportation. Our job is to make sure that those transformations not only happen, but they work for all of us, and there's no better place to talk about that than right here. So I'm looking forward to digging into the discussion, and thank you again for having me this afternoon.
Joining Secretary Buttigieg on stage, please welcome Devin Scillian, anchor at WDIV-TV4, NBC.
Mr. Secretary, it's great to have you here. Really tickled to get to talk to you. It's an interesting thing to talk to you because, as I was explaining to you earlier, even though your purview, of course, is transportation, as the Secretary of Transportation, we have all come to know you as sort of a national political figure, and so you and I are going to talk about some other matters as well. But let's start, if we could, with where we are on some bigger transportation-related issues, in particular the supply chain right now. The supply chain's a hot mess. And of course, critics of the administration believe that it's...
Is that the technical term?
I looked it up, yes. And critics of the administration believe that some of it was, while some of it certainly hasn't been predictable, other portions of it have been, and we just have not reacted well enough. So give me your take on what the supply chain looks like to you.
Well, look, supply chain problems have been building in this country for decades. Mm-hmm. The underinvestment that went on in every part of our transportation infrastructure left us vulnerable to shocks. And then we had the mother of all shocks in the form of the pandemic. And that's when the supply chain issues began, right? It didn't begin when a certain political party came to power. It began the first week of the pandemic when you couldn't get any toilet paper. And by the end of that year, it was Wendy's not being able to serve burgers at 1/5 of their restaurants because the beef wasn't available. And then it has gone on in one form or another each passing month. And it's a real struggle. So what do we do about it? Well, there's obviously the long-term work that we should have been doing from the 1980s on, and we're doing it now. Tomorrow we'll be announcing rail infrastructure grants that will improve the fluidity of goods movement on rail in 36 states plus the District of Columbia. We have been investing in ports. And I want to emphasize for our supply chains, it's not just the big ones that you see on TV. $52 million that we did for the port of Long Beach, for example, to help them get rail onto the dock. That's very important.
Yeah.
But I'll tell you also the $1.5 million we're sending to Marquette, the 3.7 that's going to Alpena, that are going to mean a lot in these specific regions are also a very important part of how we get goods to where they need to go. So that's the long-term investment we need to make. The truth is, we can't wait for a long-term investment to untangle some of the issues we have right now. That's why we're engaging the private sector companies that own and operate most of our supply chains. Remember, nobody wants or needs the federal government to own a shipping company or a warehouse or a trucking operation, right? This is supposed to be private sector. Yeah. But there is a public-private partnership in terms of making sure that it flows. That's why we've taken steps like bringing the different players to the table to exchange data. You wouldn't believe how much data is not shared between the different players in our supply chain, from the ocean shipper to the port to the terminal operator to the rail operator to the warehouse. It would it's almost, I'm exaggerating a little, but not much. In terms of goods movement, it's almost as if you knew that somebody was coming, you knew that a cousin of yours was on their way to the airport. You knew they were flying in.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't actually know whether they were going to Traverse City or Pellston, or what airline they were on, or exactly which day they were coming. How would you go pick them up? That's actually a little bit of the dynamic with some of what's going on in our goods movement. We can address that through the sharing of data between these different players. I'm not talking about proprietary data. I'm talking about data that they can and should be sharing, and we're working on that. We're working on pressing the shippers and holding them accountable if they leave their containers sitting around, which is how we cut the number of long-dwelling containers at the coastal ports by more than half. So my point is we've got to couple those short-term measures with these long-term investments so that when we have the next shock, pandemic, weather disaster, war, who knows, that we're more resilient and able to meet it without these kinds of painful experiences.
The short-term measures that we need, I mean, we're in a situation right now where obviously we have a huge problem with inflation, and that is, basically by definition, a lot of dollars chasing too few goods. Mm-hmm. The administration was a little wrong on how long inflation was going to last, how bad it was going to be. Lawrence Summers predicted this morning that we're headed for a recession if we don't suddenly jump interest rates by a lot. I mean, this is all looking rather bleak in the short term even, but that starts to become a long-term problem now. How do we address all that?
Well, first of all, let's look at the shock waves that are still moving through the economy, right? I mean, a big part of how we're here is that we were brought to the brink of a depression just 2 years ago. Mm-hmm. And have replaced that with some of the fastest job growth that the economy's ever seen, some of the lowest unemployment rates that we have ever experienced. Yeah. And yes, a problem on the supply side keeping up. So we need to invest in our supply side, and I use that term carefully because I mean it a little differently than the way it was used during the Reagan administration. Yeah. But the administration is very focused on making sure we support the productive capacity of this country, whether we're talking about transportation, whether we're talking about workforce, whether we're talking about raw materials, to keep up and to catch up. But there's no question that this is a concern. Our piece of it, transportation-wise, is shipping costs, keeping those under control because they went through the roof on everything from ocean shipping to trucking. And that's a supply issue. Mm-hmm. But on all of these pieces, this is a real challenge. Now, I will say that the politicization of it is predictable, but unfortunate. I was just at a meeting of transportation ministers in Germany. A lot of the transportation ministers get together every year and compare notes. And you know, in the Eurozone, they're seeing 6, 7, 8% inflation. And I was saying, gosh, it's really striking that some people would think that you know, the Biden-Harris administration's policies here in Europe have led to inflation here. Look, this is a global phenomenon. That's not to minimize it by any means. It's to make clear that this global phenomenon is something that is not the result of politics, but it does need to be addressed through policy.
Yeah. In fact, we have this weird disconnect. We just did a poll, the Chamber just released a poll yesterday that showed that while everybody's chief concern right now seems to be inflation in the economy, over 70% of the people who responded to the poll said that their own financial situation is better or the same than it was, but that also helps create inflation. If everybody keeps spending and unemployment is very low, then we're on our way to...
Look, that's what pushes prices up, right? People are spending on goods and services and the productive supply side. That's why I'm talking about the supply side. But look, for the better part of my political lifetime, jobs and the economy were the same thing. And now we're facing the fact that the economy has to do with jobs, but it also has to do with prices. Yeah. And that's one of the reasons why the president has made clear that his number one economic priority right now is the pricing side right now, is inflation.
Yeah. Let's talk about the price of gas, which of course helps drive a lot of this, but is also bottling up. It makes everything more expensive. Yeah. We're also, especially the price of diesel, which just keeps rocketing out of sight. How can we address that? released, a certain amount of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to I guess it depends on how you look at it. Either had no effect or it would have been worse if we hadn't.
I think it is the latter, right? I mean, that's a step that we know can stabilize global oil prices, and the global oil prices are what leads to the gas prices and diesel prices you see at the pump. Although I can't help but mention that when the oil prices go up, the gas prices seem to go up in lockstep. And then when oil prices settle a little bit, this reverse does not seem to be the case.
Yes.
And I think that deserves some attention.
Of course.
But look, bottom line is, folks are hurting. And whether you're an owner-operator truck driver who is already facing a lot of pressure right now, or whether you're just a family trying to have a good Memorial Day weekend, we're all feeling this. And there are sets of things we can do about this. One is the direct action. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve, for example, largest coordinated action ever that the president led in this area. The flexibility around ethanol. The proposals for a use it or lose it policy toward oil companies that are just sitting on these permits, saying we're not going to put those investments in the drill bit, and why would we? We're pretty profitable right now. And saying, okay, well, if you're not producing, then why do you have these permits? Then there's the other side, which is the rest of the family's budget. In other words, of all the different things that a family pays for in your family budget, some of them can be more directly addressed through policy than others. Mm-hmm. And some of the things that we could control, frankly, a lot more directly than gas prices are ones that the president, the administration, and the House have, and a lot of senators are on board with this, but not enough for it to have gotten done, to look at some of these other prices that people are facing to take the edge off. We had a bill move through the House to take insulin to $35. Yeah. To lower the cost of prescription drugs. We are pushing to lower the cost of housing. We're working to lower the cost of childcare. All of these things would make it so much easier for a family to get by when they are facing these terrible swings in the price of oil and gas.
Yeah, yeah. Let's move to transportation in broader terms. 10 years ago, we might have been hard-pressed to describe the transportation world of today. I'm not sure we understood what Lyft and Uber were going to become. I'm not sure we saw how quickly the automakers were going to try to adapt to the electrification of their fleets. Tell me a little bit about, if you close your eyes and think about what our transportation world looks like 10 years from now, what do you see?
Well, first, we should approach any predictions with a lot of humility for the reasons you just raised, right? Think about one of the lessons of Uber and Lyft. For all the transportation technology that's been developed in the last 10, 20, 30 years, the most important piece of transportation technology of the last decade isn't even a piece of transportation equipment, it's a phone, right? That's what actually changed everything from how you board an airplane to how you summon a ride. And so there's a big unknown factor about some of the changes, but there are some that we can see. Electrification is going to accelerate, and I think it's only going to become more important. The OEMs have made big bets on this, and we need to do it as a country in order to meet our climate goals and in order to make sure that American workers on American soil get the benefit of this electric revolution. And so we're investing $7.5 billion in charging stations. And we've also proposed measures to make those EVs more affordable, so that more families can realize the gas savings that come with owning one. So we know electrification is going to matter. We know automation is going to develop in some very fast-moving, well, let me put an asterisk on that. Fast-moving, but we don't know when some of the fastest movements will happen. Yep. Again, we need some humility here. As somebody who started following this issue as a mayor, it feels sometimes as if widespread use of automated vehicles is exactly 10 years away, and it's been exactly 10 years away for 10 years. And so, again, some humility is called.
It's an extraordinary thing that happens.
But what we do know is we need to update our regulatory frameworks to keep up. Interestingly, there's actually no federal regulation that says you have to have a driver in a car, because nobody ever thought of that. But also, if we're writing a safety standard for a driverless car, right now it says what the airbag should look like in the passenger seat and in the driver's seat. Right. So we're updating even just the language of our most basic regulations. There's a lot of interest in Congress right now on a framework for how we handle automation, not so much to create it, that's what industry's got to do. Yeah. Again, the private sector has its role, but our role is to make sure that it's safe. And by the way, the potential for safety improvements from automation is colossal in a country where human drivers are killing 40,000 people a year.
Exactly.
We should be up in arms about that.
But how will insurance work if I'm willing to turn my car over to the system? Right. Where's the liability?
That's
complicated.
Yes, that's one of the biggest issues that we've got to work through. And of course, we've got to make sure it unfolds in a way that benefits American workers. And it absolutely could, but that's far from guaranteed. Now, then there are the things that people don't think about a lot in terms of technology and development. And the most exciting, unsexy one that I'm paying attention to is materials. And I know this does not sizzle the way self-driving cars or drones or EVs do. But if you just think about literally how much paving we do, for example, as a country, and how much a hit to the budgets of cities and states that is, if you can make it just a little bit better, and there are amazing technologies right now around recycled material in pavement, porous pavement. There are even solar roadways being developed to see if you can generate energy through these materials. And this is, I think the business minds here in particular should think about this. Right now, the incentives are such that if you're a local or state decision maker, and you were presented an opportunity to have asphalt or another paving material that lasts, let's say, 50% longer in a northern Michigan winter, but you have to pay a 30% premium in order to get it, even though textbook economics says that's a no-brainer, you might actually be compelled to say no because you need to get more done right now, right this year.
Yeah.
And that's part of what we're trying to address through the improved funding in the infrastructure law, to give people the freedom to think on a longer-term basis, and then let the private sector do what it does best.
So 10 years from now, how much of the driving do you think that we're watching on our roadways is this connected sort of autonomous driving? How much of it is us still doing it the old way?
So I think
in the Pete Buttigieg world that you could build.
I think, the majority of the driving 10 years from now is still certainly going to be people behind wheels. The question is how, in the perfect world that I could build, I actually care less about exactly exactly how the technology works and more just what is the outcome.
Yeah.
I want a world where we don't have 40,000 people dying every year. If we just stop and think about it for a second. I mean, everyone in this room could close your eyes and picture someone you care about who was killed in a car crash. And we're just used to it. It's as if we spent our whole lives in a country at war.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be that way. If you look at other countries, they have some of them have dramatically lower rates of roadway deaths than we do. If you look at different parts of this country, some have dramatically lower rates of roadway deaths than others.
Yep.
We should be working toward a time when dying in a car crash is as quaint and anachronistic as dying of cholera or dysentery. And I think we can get there. And I don't care how, but I think this technology is going to be a big part of it.
Interesting. I drive an electric car, so I'm already in the choir. But I know that every day you hear from people who believe that, A, the push to electrification has gone so fast and so far out in front of what's reasonable that that's part of what's helped create our gasoline problems that we have right now. You also hear continually that this electricity that I'm pouring into an electric car and that other people are is still made largely by fossil fuels. So we're not as green as we look, and we're just kind of kidding ourselves. So all of the foibles that you are presented with, how do you answer that about our drive to be electric? That are we too early for what's really reasonable given how green we want to be?
Yeah, and the answer is no, because we're running out of time. This is not that it's easy. This is a complicated transition. But when somebody says, oh, I'm worried about the raw materials, or I'm worried about the grid, usually that question comes in one of two forms. If it comes in the form of how are we going to fix it, I'm right there with you. If it comes in the form of, therefore, let's do the status quo for as long as possible, we literally don't have time. We can't afford to do that. I don't know how more bluntly to put it than the scientists have. But I would also add that a Great Lakes state is exceptionally vulnerable, and you don't have to be next to the water. You could be, well, in Midland, for example, right? Or things like what just happened in Gaylord. Like, there's gonna be more of this, and it's going to cost trillions of dollars, and the biggest part of climate, the biggest sector contributing to climate, greenhouse gases, is transportation. And the most actionable part of that is electric. Now, to take a few of these critiques in turn quickly. First of all, is it zero emissions? Well, no. If your electricity is made with fossil fuels,
not net, yes.
But it's getting cleaner by the day, and it is already likely more efficient, even if you're only using fossil fuels, which we're trying to advance away from. It's more efficient, if you just think about it, to take all that fuel in a power plant, turn it into electrons, and then transmit it to a battery, than it is to put it individually in millions of gas tanks and into an engine to set it on fire there and turn it into power. It's just more efficient at utility scale. So that's one thing to think about. Another thing to think about that I think is really important, and one of the reasons I'm excited about what I see in the industry, is that, look, early on, EVs read as this very urban, it's the kind of, you're sipping your latte, listening to NPR, on your way to yoga, and you're in your electric car. That was the perception, right? But actually, a lot of the biggest wins here in terms of fuel savings are in rural America. Just think about it. First of all, you're driving longer distances, means you're burning more gas, means you're going to save more money if you got an electric car or a truck. And I'm amazed by how many people are still learning about electric pickup trucks.
Yep.
And the truth is, the Super Bowl ads will do more than any speech from me on this. But I think as people see that, plus you have the added fact that it is in rural America that people are more likely to live in single-family homes, which means for all this talk about charging infrastructure that makes it sound like a super complicated, obscure thing you got to get your hands on, you already have some. It's the plug in your wall. That's how we charge our hybrid electric minivan. Reluctantly became a minivan dad as soon as the twins arrived.
You'll be all right. And it happens to all of us. It happens to all of us.
I guess it's inevitable.
Yes.
We plug it in. We'll get a level 2 charger eventually, which will be more efficient, but we just plug it in. So the bigger issue is cost, and that's a real issue. Mm-hmm. Right now, even though your car payment's higher, your gas bill's lower, depending on the vehicle, you may be close to the point of evening out. We got more work to do to bring the cost down. And so anybody who tries to mount a political attack on the subject of EVs being expensive should answer a simple question. When you had the opportunity to lower EV costs through tax credits, did you vote for it or did you vote against it? And we can continue the conversation after getting that answer.
I want to ask you one question about air travel, maybe two, because I never hear a whole lot of advances. I mean, airplanes still seem to run on the, nobody's talking about, I don't hear a lot of talk about electric planes yet.
Not in the near term.
Not in the near term.
But you got sustainable aviation fuel, which goes into existing aircraft, which is exciting.
That helps. I talked to a friend who works for an airline who said that the U.S. is being obstinate and ridiculous with the pre-testing requirements right now for return to the U.S. Surrounding COVID, that the rest of the world has pretty much done away with that, and right now we're in alliance with China as a nation requiring, and that it's putting a real damper on domestic travel has returned, international travel has not. Is it time to get rid of that rule?
So that call sits ultimately with public health folks. It's the CDC working with TSA.
But even the CDC has now made it a 5-day, from the time that you've had, and it's still, I believe, a 2-week quarantine if you test positive before you can come back. I believe that's where it still stands. But anyway,
right.
The overall thing.
So yeah, look, that's a restriction that still gets in the way of travel, and we recognize that. And nobody will be happier than me when we get the clearance to move forward. But of course, the CDC has to get there.
I saw here I had a note that I forgot to get to when we were talking about supply chain issues. We've got a real problem with the driver shortage right now that goes immense implications.
Glad you asked. Well, I guess I didn't let you get to a question.
Oh, no, what do we do about that? If unemployment is as low as it is, where are we going to find drivers?
So we got to treat drivers better. That's a really big part of it. We got to treat drivers a lot better. Right now, The industry estimates there's a gap of about 80,000. My department, our BTS, not the BTS that was at the White House yesterday, the Bureau of Transportation Statistics, slightly less famous, but they estimate that we're about 300,000 drivers short, leaving every year, leaving the job.
Yeah.
I was at a port in Newark, and I rode along with a driver. I did it in Illinois a few weeks ago. We need to treat drivers better. They need better parking. That's not just a convenience thing, that's a safety thing for them. We need to pay attention to economic structures where nobody pays for wasting a driver's time. Think about it, because they don't get paid by the hour. I mean, some do, but those who get paid by the load or by the mile, if you're just sitting at a port gate and the port's not organized enough to get you to the berth in 5 hours, or you're sitting at the warehouse and they say, sorry, we're just not ready, or there's not a chassis ready for you,
or at the Canadian border.
Or you're at the Canadian border, you are eating that cost.
Yep.
If the wheels aren't turning, the owner-operator life can be great, but if the wheels aren't turning, you're not making any money.
Yeah.
So we've launched a partnership with the Department of Labor to look at compensation. We're looking at leasing arrangements. We're looking at recruiting more veterans. We got to get more women into the workforce. And that means taking some specific steps to make sure that it is an appealing and safe job for women drivers. Yeah. Who, sexist jokes aside, have statistically every indication of being the drivers we want to make sure that we are bringing into the workforce. And it's insane to be leaving 50% of the talent on the table when we have a worker shortage. I could say that about a lot of sectors, but driving is certainly one of them. We are working on apprenticeships. We've got, I think, up to 100 companies now signed up for apprenticeships to get more people into the pipeline. So we're doing more than we ever have, I think, on recruitment, but it will be a leaky bucket unless we do just as much on retention. That's why we got to treat our drivers better. Everything you're wearing, whatever you ate for breakfast today, maybe even the vehicle that you drive, got to you thanks to a truck driver.
A driver.
And if we really mean it when we say they're essential workers, we ought to show it.
Yeah. We've got just a couple minutes left. I want to get to some other issues that are facing us, as I mentioned we would. You have become, I think, rightly, one of the leading voices on LGBTQ issues in America. When we saw the reasoning, and we don't know yet whether it's going to hold from the Supreme Court with the leaked draft opinion, there were some people who were concerned that it showed a roadmap for a rollback of some rights that now we've developed, gay marriage among them. Give me your concerns over what we've gleaned from that opinion.
Yeah, I mean, obviously this is really personal. I started my day at our wonderful house in Traverse City, and my wonderful husband single-handedly feeding our wonderful kids because I had to get on the road. And thinking about the fact that the very existence of our household, at least legally speaking, came about by the margin of a single vote on the Supreme Court, has you really thinking at a moment like this about the personal stakes of what appears to be a continued push to roll back rights. Look, for as long as we've been, a lot longer than that, I mean, for as long as we've been a republic, we have been on a steady, if uneven, path toward rights and freedoms being expanded rather than taken away. And I think the question that has been raised by the Roe decision, and I understand and grew up with a lot of people who have very strong views on either side of this issue, but at the end of the day, we reached a view as a country that the way we would resolve this very difficult issue is to trust women. And after 50 years, that's apparently being thrown out the window. The broader question that I think is before us now will be, did we live to see the high water mark of rights and freedoms in this country and watch that begin to move in the opposite direction for the first time in history? Or is this a setback on the road toward more secure rights and freedoms for everybody? And you know what side I'm going to be on.
kind of coming off of what Ted Koppel said we talked about a few moments ago, or as I refer to him, St. Ted, this division that we have right now, and when you see, I think we are never going to agree on abortion in America. I don't think we're ever going to agree on guns. And as those now are fomenting as two massive issues heading into yet another election, I'm having a crisis of imagination in understanding what it is that brings us all back together again. And can you give me any optimism on that, or are you just as distraught over our divided states of America as I am?
Well, I'm no less distraught, but let me offer some fodder for imagination.
Sure.
I think a lot of the salvation is going to come from the local, first of all. I always believed that when I was a mayor. I believe it even more strongly after becoming a federal official. You look at, I was Mayor Duggan earlier, you talk to local leaders, you see what they're doing, and you see people working on the ground in an environment where you don't have the luxury of retreating to partisan corners. You just have to fill the holes in the road. You just have to get the community through the challenges that it faces. I also believe that the fundamental principles that make America America, however imperfectly we've risen to them over the years, matter, that they're the right ones, that this is a better way to organize a society than some of the other models that are throwing their weight around right now, like China's model. And that's not to bring it all back to transportation. That's part of why we're working so hard on this, because even the deepest, highest-minded issues of democracy versus autocracy come back in some ways to very concrete issues of delivery. This is not the first time that the question has been called on whether democracy is the way to go. As recently as the 1930s, it was fashionable in certain circles of business and political elites in America to start talking approvingly about this fascism stuff going on in Europe. And part of what they used to say, famously, by way of an excuse for Mussolini was, well, he's kind of a rough guy, but he makes the trains run on time. It came back to transportation as an example. By the way, that wasn't true. So we can talk about that another day. So my point is, we need to deliver on some of the basics right now, just for our country to tiptoe back from the brink of the cliff that we have been wrestling alongside, so that we can have more adult conversations about some of the heavier stuff. But let me also offer, and I caught the tail end of what Ted Koppel was saying, and I think it's profound, and I think he's absolutely right. But since he mentioned that kind of dark potential, and thankfully, in his view, at least won't happen in the next 5 or 10 years, but I'm thinking a lot about the middle of this century, when I'll be getting ready to retire, and my kids will be, I guess, of kind of young professional age, when I think we really will have decisively gone one way or the other. And since we've seen a vision of what going off the cliff looks like, let me offer the other side of that. The world has never actually seen a large-scale, fully functioning, fully inclusive, multi-ethnic, multiracial, democratic republic that represented everybody. We've never actually had that all the way. But we could. And I believe that will happen for humanity, if and only if we deliver it here in America. And if we can figure out how to do it, which does mean building trust, it does mean taking care of the basics, and it does mean transcending these divisions of this moment. But if we can do it, that will be as big a contribution to humanity as 1776 was. And we could be the ones who actually brought it about. So that's my best shot at imagination about what the other side of that coin looks like.
Ladies and gentlemen, Pete Buttigieg. Thank you. Even some rumors running around that maybe Pete Buttigieg could one day run for office coming out of the state of Michigan, given that they now have a home in Traverse City. We'll see where that goes. I also, though, of course, want to turn a little bit of attention to the business climate right now, not just in Michigan, but certainly specifically for Detroit. I often like to turn to Dennis Archer Jr. To talk about those kind of things. This is this conversation that he and I had this past week. Good to see you again, my friend.
It's good to see you, man. This weather I can't believe we're sitting outside. The sun is out. It's 60 degrees. I'm looking at the bridge. This is fantastic.
And you and I both have been here fighting snow flurries before for this event. I'm really curious about what your take is right now. It's interesting. There's a fair amount of pessimism in numbers because of, we look at the way people feel, and we looked at that poll, and it showed us that lots of concern about inflation and lots of concern about the economy, and yet you start drilling down and you ask people one-on-one at this thing, how things going for you? Everybody's telling me, really good. So there seems to be a little bit of a Jekyll and Hyde here going on.
Well, it's interesting. It's kind of like the tale of two cities. And so I think national unemployment's around 3.6. We may be a little bit higher in Michigan, but we know as employers that we have open positions that are very hard to fill. And so for me, whether that be in our hospitality business or in our warehouse and distribution business, we've got open positions, and I think that we're paying competitive wages, and it's hard to get people to come and take these jobs. I had a conversation a little while ago about someone in the legal field who's trying to hire lawyers into the firm. And now when lawyers can now, in many instances, depending upon what they do, if they're not going to court, Devin, they can work from home. So you can get hired by a LA firm or a New York firm and make LA and New York wages and live in Detroit. And so it's just the whole marketplace for talent. Throughout this whole weekend, talent has been a theme, and I think that's the biggest challenge. We'll get beyond COVID. We've learned a lot about it. We will eventually get beyond the supply chain challenges that I've had and many people, particularly those of us in the automotive industry, have had. But talent, it's changing permanently, and it's evolving permanently. It's not going back to the way it was. And I think that's the one area where we have to adjust. And when I talk about the tale of two cities, you know, there are companies here who've been on stage that said, hey, during COVID, we've had our best years. But you got people that are spending $100 to fill their gas tank too. And so now they have to decide, can I go to the grocery store or should I fill my tank so I can go to work and take my kids to school? So that's the challenge we're facing.
Yeah. We're seeing some real push while we all adapted to working at home, and that was employers and employees alike. We're seeing some pushback now from some bosses who want people in the office. We know Elon Musk this week tweeted out, if you're not back in the office here by such and such a date, I'm going to assume you no longer work here.
Yeah, well, I think, you know, he can maybe make that proclamation because maybe he's providing those people with stock options and they're there on the if come. But for those of us who are not Elon Musk, if I was to make that proclamation, I might as well swing the door open and help and escort people out, because employers are no longer, in most industries, are no longer going to be able to dictate that people come to work for 40 or 50 hours a week in the workplace. Those days are over. Now, again, there are some industries where it actually does require, but for those that don't, we're not going back to that.
It's an interesting problem for then, say, the city of Detroit, which relies on people coming into the city to work.
Yes.
And then going home, and by doing that, you pay city income taxes. If you work from home, you don't.
And oh, by the way, if you don't come down to work, then you're less likely to come by restaurants downtown for happy hour or for lunch.
Exactly.
And so
this is a really tricky needle here.
Yeah, and it's a vicious cycle because we work very well with Bedrock. You know, they're our landlord at Central, and they would like us to open back up for lunch. And so we're saying, well, there's not enough people downtown. We don't think to open up for lunch. And then they say, well, in order to get people to come back to work, the amenities have to be back open. So it's like, who's going to give first?
Yep.
And so it's very tricky. And for those of us in hospitality particularly, you don't want to get yourself into a losing proposition.
Yeah.
So it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out over the course of the summer months.
Yeah. What are you finding are the biggest changes that you've had to adapt to after COVID that, as you just said, are permanent? What are the biggest ones for you?
I think that people have gotten used to being at home with their families and being there if someone needs to go to the doctor or a child is sick, or just wanting to be home, particularly when their kids were home from school. And so people really want to be part of their family. That family, the work-life balance is really blending, in my opinion. And so it's very hard to keep the two separate. Even if people come back into the office, people are running out more to do more personal things because they got used to doing that for 2 years. So I think that's one. Two, it's just finding people. I mean, I've got a number of different industries within which I work, and across the board, it's just hard to find people to come to work. And
is it existential?
I don't know. I wish I could, because they have to be doing something.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure. They can't. Everyone's not flocked to any, I don't think, particular industry. Because again, we've got hospitality, we've got marketing, and we've got warehouse and distribution. And across the board, it's an issue.
Is it an existential threat to you to stay in business and open, I guess is what
No.
It's not
it's not to that point.
Yeah.
It's taking longer. Here's what is happening. It's taking longer to fill roles. And so when there's a gap, so let's just say one of my clients has a team of 5 people, and that team may be operating right now with 3.
Yeah.
And so those 3 people might be working 60 hours a week.
Yeah.
Well, that's untenable. And so they're going to get burned out, and then that may cause someone else to start looking. And so that's the issue. It's not a threat to the business, but it's a threat to the quality of work life.
Yeah.
Which ultimately, it's not going to shut the business down, but we're having to look at really non-traditional ways to go after folks. We're offering incentives to existing staff to bring folks in for interviews and that sort of thing, because using the Indeed.com and what we normally would do that got us results, it doesn't work fast enough for us anymore.
Not fast enough.
No.
Funny. That was its stock and trade originally.
Right, exactly.
Indeed was like instantaneous.
Instant, right.
And now it's not fast enough. Yeah. Lastly, you understand the dynamics of a lot of conversations going on here about inclusiveness.
Yeah,
of
course.
And sharing and what's going on in Detroit. If you were to give us a report card right now, because we started talking about this a long time ago, and then COVID wrecked maybe a fair amount of progress or stopped it at least for a while. Where are we now?
Well, I think there's multiple different measures. As we look at the work that we do with the Chamber, and I chair the Racial Justice and Economic Equality Committee.
Yeah.
And so there are multiple measures. There's supplier diversity, there's development that goes on, there's access to capital. And I think that, number one, it depends on who you ask, because there are some firms that are doing very well. And I think what I've learned up here from conversations I've had, Devin, is the one thing that for minority-owned businesses that we can do better to help is to get them just in the room. Get into the room where the decisions are being discussed, opportunities are discussed very early on, because oftentimes when people hear about opportunities, it's too late.
It's done.
And so whether that's traditionally at a golf club or at the racquetball court at the DAC, wherever these conversations are being had early on, there needs to be more inclusivity there.
Yeah.
Because I think things have gotten better. I think one of the local business trades had a front page story about how particularly African American developers are doing bigger deals, more substantial deals, and they're doing them themselves, not in joint ventures. And so I think that there's a plus there. We did a poll prepared to come up here, and 83% of the people or so, 60% of the people said that their business, and these are all African American owned businesses, were growing at the pace with the rest of the economy. 18% or so said access to capital is getting better. And so I think things are improving. I think that when George Floyd happened, there are a number of our local larger institutions that made certain proclamations about what they were going to do differently.
Yeah.
And I think many of them have, all of them have not, but many of them have made those strides, and I think we're seeing the benefits of that now.
You win for best dressed this week.
I'm trying,
This
man.
is
You look, man. You with these shoes, I don't know.
This is amazing what you got on. Really interesting times and a lot of interesting riddles for our business leaders to solve going forward now in this post-COVID world that we try to figure out, are we at a bump? Are we at a new normal? Fortunately, some things remain constant, just like this beautiful old hotel, this largest porch in the world, and one of the signature scenes that you see right now from Drone 4 of the wonderful Mackinac Island up in the Mackinac Straits. So great to have you with us for this special edition of Flashpoint on Local 4 Plus.